Alright folks, in this lesson we are going to build our 3D comp. Now this is the basic skeletal structure of all the different passes kind of incorporated of the CG kind of Blade Runner-esque screens up here. And from there we're going to do, in the future lessons, color correction and tweaking. That's really what compositing is. It's really building, you build the initial network, and then the nitty-gritty is getting in there and really tweaking all types of little things. And believe me, we're going to need a lot of tweaking for this. So the first thing we're going to do is, you can see I've added a couple of dot nodes on this here right off of our switch node. And for a good reason, I want to keep this organized. I've already done this comp already, but I want to lay it out very clean for you, as opposed to what people usually do when they build a comp from scratch. They build it out and then they got to move the nodes around and get it from going left to right, top to bottom. So we're going to come way back here to the class content and take a look at the goods. I discussed in lesson 1 on what these passes are, so I'm not going to waste your time with that. We're going to just start to pull this stuff in. So I'm going to hold down Control and pull out a dot node. And again, I just like adding dot nodes, and I'll just grab this and start to move this down with beautiful 90-degree angles, as you can see here. Let's pull this guy way down here. And we got to go way down, don't we? Okay, so let's go down here. There we go. All right, and I'll add one more dot node. Throw that over here. And again, this pipeline, we don't do any removal of anything. You could technically remove specific channels in here that we've already used. Like, for instance, you might want to, I don't know, remove the plate shot if you feel like it's going to actually, be more computationally expensive. Let's go ahead and take a look at the footage in general here. So if let's take a look at the setup here. It's looking good. We're going to build out the beauty pass. The beauty pass consists of the combination of a series of elements that make up what is currently on my RGBA channel. The RGBA channel consists of your direct, plus together with the emissive, plus together with the indirect, plus together with the specular. And that gives you your quote-unquote beauty pass. So I'm going to go ahead and make a shuffle node and plug this in right here. And we are going to shuffle in the direct pass. Now, if you guys aren't familiar with shuffle nodes, if there are only 3 channels within a specific channel here, so for instance, you can see if I go to some of these, they have 4 channels, and then some of these they have 4 channels, and here you have 3 channels. So whenever you shuffle in this, it just takes the channel that, if there's no alpha, it just shuffles in the last actual input into the alpha here, so there's nothing to do. So I just usually just shift that to white. So what you get, if you look at through the shuffle node here, is RGBA, and A is turned to white. So you can see it's just like a switch track we talked about before. And with that, we're going to go ahead and actually label this. And I don't label it up here in the name. I actually label it in the node. So this is the direct, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Okay, so I'll just call this direct. Shuffle direct, and I'm going to make another offshoot here and make a dot node by hitting period and bringing this over here, and just take this and copy and paste it and throw it over here. And each one of these we're going to do, for instance, just come over here and do indirect and then relabel it indirect. And right, and this should be good. So here's your indirect, and then we're going to merge these together. Hit M for merge. Since this is an asymmetrical operation, plus is an asymmetrical operation, which means if I did 3 plus 2 or 2 plus 3, doesn't matter which number is on top or at the bottom. Although I do like to have B coming from the left to right, A as the new incoming input. I'll hold down Control and make a little dot node here. And now you can see if I just hit merge, it's set to over, so I have to put this to plus. So this consists of the direct lighting and the indirect lighting. The indirect lighting obviously is the bounce lighting that comes from indirect sources and so forth, and just the direct lighting bouncing off of other sources. All right. The next I'm going to do is emissive. So again, I could just copy paste this and connect it. Hold down Control, pull this out. And we will call this emissive. And even if we spell it wrong, For the life of me, I don't remember how to spell emissive. I think it's with 2 S's. I could be wrong. College professor here. All right, emission, and there we go. Same thing. Put our viewer to it. You can see all these wonderful little color dots. And again, we have to basically break down our beauty paths so we can individually color correct different elements, such as if we want to color correct the hue of different television screens, or if we want blinking lights on only a couple of television screens, we could do all that between here and here. So again, I will set this to plus just like before, B and then A input, put my viewer to it, so you can see the progressive buildup of the CG elements. It's important to note as we start to merge these together, the B input continues to drag along with it all of these different inputs here, all of these arbitrary output variables in the pipeline. It's only if we come in here, for instance, if I hit M for merge, put this as the A input, and then I'll make a constant, make that the B input. The B input, obviously, at this constant has no passes, and because it's the B side, gets the favor. If I put myself to the merge node, we have lost all that data that we had before. So again, it's important to realize that, and also realize that it's actually going to be bogging down our comp as we kind of move through this pipeline. So we could have done a couple removes, or whatever, sometimes, and then you could, reshuffle them in later on if you wish to kind of keep your comp workflow and pipeline very, very light through the process. But I'm going to go ahead and delete that. So let's put in our last pass, which is the specular, and I always say it's the unsung hero of photorealistic CG. So I will go ahead and shuffle this one in and make it the specular. And again, just call it specular. It's good to the very least label these shuffle nodes so you know what's being merged in here. And then I could just copy and paste this plus sign, B on this side, A for a top, put our viewer to it. And you can see this consists of, as we kind of add it together, our final CG here, or beauty pass. Now, we have corrupted the alpha channel in this process. If I hit the A for alpha, at least in this case, it's set to white. And because it's been adding things together, if I hold down control and sample the area, you can see the alpha value is 4, and that's because we took a value of 1, 2, 3, and 4 and added it together. So it's just been adding together the alpha channel of a value of 1 for each and every one of these. So now we have to redefine the alpha channel with a copy node. So I'm going to take a copy node, and again, this is where we say what's the incoming A alpha input. This will be the RGBA input of the alpha of the original, and then we'll put this B for the background plate. So it's basically reassigning the alpha channel. So if I put our viewer to the copy node here and hit A, we have returned our beautiful alpha in our shot. So again, this is just the setup of the beauty pass, and it's looking pretty good. What I'll do at this point is do a couple of grade nodes in here. So I'll add a grade node here, grade node here, grade node here, and just hitting G to make these grade nodes. And that's it. So then I can grab all this stuff and, oops, make sure I get that in there, and just grab it, tab, type in backdrop, and I will make this, call this beauty pass CG, and give it a nice little color that is very pretty or something. Doesn't really matter, honestly. Pull this over here. So I think one last thing we should definitely add here is a pre-mult, because we need to pre-multiply the background plate to the actual alpha, and that consists of our beauty pass. Now I'm going to do overall color correction, and to do that, anytime you do color correction, you should unpre-mult. So we just pre-multed, but when it comes to the network for the overall color correction, we want to unpre-mult this. I found that working with pro compositors, when I was dealing with these big shots who were working from Hollywood, and then I was just taking grade nodes and setting it to, unpre-mult RGBA, which basically does an unpre-mult and pre-mult before and after for you. They said, nah, I don't think so, Matt. We prefer to keep things pretty simple here, so make sure you put a visible unpre-mult that the compositor doesn't have to go and look around for. They know that what you did here visibly, as opposed to having to go into a node and looking at it. Every compositing post house is probably a little different, but again, it's best to do that. So I'm going to add a grade. I'm going to hit the letter C for cat for color correction. I'm going to do a hue correct node in here, just a couple of corrections in here. We're gonna add a whole bunch of color correction work in here as we kind of move along, and then of course I'm going to add a pre-mult to this. So we're kind of back on track. So this is overall color correction. This is individual channel-based color correction, and you definitely want to have both in here. So I will take this here, and I will make a backdrop, and I'm going to hold down Control while getting the backdrop pulled off to the side, and then extend this out like that. And I'll just call this overall CG CC color correct. CC is commonly a nice little acronym for color correction, and your compositors usually know what you're doing, so I kind of like keep it nice and clean like that. So we're back in our pre-mult state. At this point, we probably can go ahead and merge this onto our plate shot, again, which is way over here. So I'm going to do an M for merge, and I'm going to merge with this little dot here. So this will be B for background, and then A for a top, obviously, will be the CG. So I'll just bring this over here and plug this into the pre-mult for now. I'll make a little dot node here so we can keep the party going down here a little bit. There we go. And this just allows me to see things. So I'm going to start jumping into some basic depth of field work. We're going to be adding our blurs next here, so I'm going to bring this down relatively low. Let's put our viewer to that merge node and see what we get. So now we have the CG composited on. It looks like a postage stamp. We have no shadows. The color correction doesn't make any sense. Again, you can see if I hit the letter Y, I could look in a grayscale mode, and you could see there is definitely a contrast in the blacks and the whites. They don't match. The whites in the actual comp itself are very milky. Like this is the darkest dark, and yet right here we have very dark blacks, and this is how you can always tell by putting this to color correction to luminance. You can go back and forth with your gamma. You'll see how there's like areas that need to be, maybe the whites need to be increased here. But you can just see the contrast in chrominance and luminance, and also blacks and whites dynamic range, just by fiddling with the gamma and going into the Y mode. Again, hit the R, G, or B to go back to color again. All right, so the first one we're going to do is the Z defocus. So I'll just come in here and type Z defocus, and I will throw that into the pipe. Now, because we have the actual depth information that's coming down this pipe, it's going to feed into the depth channel. So here is it's actually reading the depth information here of the bazillions of passes that are coming in here. I just realized right now, am I seeing things? Oh no, that's not there. Okay, those vector passes are in there. All right, so with that said, you can see it's basically reading off of here, and this is set to far 0. We have a result, and you can see everything is basically out of focus. There is this little focal point, which I can put anywhere in the shot and choose what's in focus. What you want to do is take your output into the focal plane setup. And what it is anything in blue is foreground out of focus. Anything in red is going to be background out of focus. So the depth channel that I showed you is driving this information. I need to increase my depth of field, and that's in the form of green, so I'm going to increase this. And if you guys know photography, green is or depth of field is basically areas that are in focus, basically. And then, of course, foreground out of focus is blue, and background out of focus is red. Because there's no data here in regards to the alpha, it doesn't know what to do, so it automatically defaults it to foreground. So you can see I can increase this and say, I want this area in focus, and then it's slowly, gradually going to go out of focus as we move further out. So with that said, let's go ahead and, again, you can change your focal plane here. You can see it's changing to what's in focus, which is really cool. So I could put that right there. And at this point, I'm going to switch back to results. And if you take a look at our original footage, you will see that we have a relative in focus area here that is blue. The A6300 has a really great facial recognition for autofocus, and that's what we did on the fly. But then as you can see further back, things are getting a little bit softer. So there is a depth of field difference here. I don't know what f-stop I had this at, but again, you can see it will go out of focus. So there's a subtle basic blurriness that has to occur further down the pipe. So just to demonstrate an exaggeration of this, I'm going to take my size and maximum, because you can put your maximum to 21 and it's going to clip or kind of max out at 10. So you got to bring these two together and you'll start to see things start to really get out of focus here. And again, I can take that point, that focal point, and choose what's in focus. So you can see as I can choose this area out of focus, and then this goes out of blur. And it's basically reading a specific number from the camera itself, as we kind of it's just resampling that number and putting it in. So here you can see the depth of field is at 0.315. That's the max that we set up, but the focal point is at these different buttons, and whatever value is there is there. It could be a value that is again a value between 0 and 1 or greater than 1, because it's based on distance from camera, the depth channel is. So there's a couple things you can be aware of when you do this. If you have a specific the actual iris of the camera or whatever, you can choose things such as the filter type being a disc or blades. And the blades you can see here, you can have like 1, 2, 3, 4, like this. And the aspect ratio, you can have blades if you want to bring the blades down to like 2 or 3, like triangles. Again, you have to know how your camera handles like bokeh-based autofocus. And then, of course, you have this thing called bloom and gamma correction. So you can actually come over here and add some bloom to the highlighted areas, the areas of heavy intensity. That, again, you're dealing with values that are between 0 and 1. That's what it's reading. So you can see it'll bloom out certain areas that are initially of high luminance values. So you can see, you can kind of pull this back here and let's kind of pull this back. There we go. So I can pull the threshold back. And again, bright luminance values are what's going to bloom out. And then again, you can come in here and make all types of issues, like make this more rounder, whatever you want. But by default, it's set to disk, which is basically a circle. So again, you can see everything is just way, way, way too out of focus here. So I put my focal point over here to this, and I'm not going to do bloom or gamma in this demonstration. Actually, you know what? Let's do a little bit of bloom, and let's up that threshold just a little bit. There we go. So we got a little bit going on. And I'm going to bring down the size maximum. Again, my focal point should be right here, which is focused as far as a distance from this guy, blue. And now there's going to be a fall off of things going out of focus. Now, how much is it going to go out of focus? Barely anything. So I'm going to bring my size and maximum down until I look at my fall off here and these two match. You can see they're a little bit too out of focus. So I'm going to start bringing these two together. And let's see here. So you can bring your maximum here and then you play with your size. And this is sort of like a governor that kind of says you can't go this far or no further. So I would say that's probably good enough. So you can see this area is very sharp. This area is slightly out of focus. And that's exactly what we want, that real subtle reality. The next blur we're going to add, you'll notice that all these blurs are basically orange in color, is the motion blur. Now, I've experimented over the years of actually just rendering out an arbitrary output variable that is the vector pass that's commonly rendered out of such programs as V-Ray or Arnold. And you would use, in that case, an actual vector blur that I demonstrated earlier, and plug that information in. But I find that the ZD focus and the vector blur combined can create some really nasty results. And I've tried reversing them, putting this on top, changing the order, and it's just been a headache of not getting it to work right, because one kind of screws up the other. And if you do one, it's going to have to, you're fiddling with not only needing to blur a specific pass, the footage, but also the pass that needs to be used later on. So what I find to use more than anything is just the motion blur node, which just samples the original RGBA information, and it does a two-dimensional based tracking. Now, if you have rotary blades on a helicopter that go in a cylindrical fashion really fast, if you have Hero spaceships or whatever that fly by the camera really quick, then you want to render motion blur in camera in Maya or whatever 3D app you're using, and then bring that in. Keep in mind all your subsequent AOV passes have to be rendered in motion blur as well, so that everything kind of matches up. And in doing so, if you render motion blur, you should render depth of field blur as well while you're at it, and bring that in. So usually in feature films, you'll see that the foreground character, if flying by the camera really quick, or big showcase foreground character, will actually have ZD focus and motion blur rendered inside of Maya and brought into the compositing package, because to be quite honest, vector-based passes here should be only used very lightly and for two-dimensional based transformations. In our case, you can see that we move around very subtly in here, and we can get away with this kind of quasi-fake motion blur, which what it does is it just samples previous and forward frames and then just establishes a little bit of blur between what it reads out. So this sucker, I find, is really does the trick most of the time. So let's take a look at it. I'm on frame 50. Let's go to frame 55, which has a decent amount of motion blur in it. And you can see if I take the shutter samples down to 2, you can see we got 2. If I take the, I'll put it to 3, and I'll take the shutter time and increase this. So depending on how much motion blur is in your shot, depends, of course, on the way at which you recorded. You can increase the vector detail for more accuracy, and then you can increase the samples to get more samples in here. So you usually don't need to go any more than like 10 in this case, depending on how heavy your motion blur is. But just judging from the footage in the shot, you could see this brick pattern here. You may want to just look at a line or something. I really don't need that much, so I'm going to bring this down to 3 samples, and I'm going to take my shutter speed down to match up like this. So I'm going to come down here, and honestly, vector detail of 0.3 is just fine. I never had any issues otherwise. So just a little bit of motion blur there, so a little something to work out any motion blur. So now you can see if you take your arrow keys and go between, you'll see, and you definitely take your time and just take your arrow keys and move through the shot. And when the shot has no motion blur, then you'll start to feel out if you need to decrease the shutter time or increase the shutter time. But overall, I think we got a good result here. So the last thing I want to add here, we have our ZD focus, we have our motion blur. One very common blur that is a little bit different than, say, a regular blur is a soften. Usually a soften is added that softens up the CG and kind of massages it in just ever so slightly. So if I take a look at it, there's a softening here. Now this is a little bit intense, so I'm going to bring this down to a 1. And you might be going, it's like nothing there. But trust me, this stuff will play a part. So you could probably just leave it for that. And then finally, we have just a defocus node. A defocus node is different than a blur node, because a blur node is just going to blur something, whereas a defocus node is actually going to give you a more accurate look of something being out of focus. In other words, it'll have more of a bokeh effect as opposed to just a Gaussian blur and so forth. So these are all of our blurs, and what we can do is take them all and make a backdrop. I'm going to hold down Control, grab my top of my backdrop, drag it over here, extend this out, and I'd like to give this a color that I can recognize from afar. So I'm going to give this a color of orangey orange. So let's give it a kind of that. So if I'm far away and I can't see the label, I know, oh, boom, there's all of my blur nodes are this sort of like orangey color. And let's just go ahead and just call this blur nodes. Again, I got a tutorial on the way which can explain how to render these passes. I have one already that does redshift. So there's a redshift tutorial. I highly recommend getting into redshift if you're a Maya person, or even if you're in Houdini. The same rules sort of apply. So next up, we're going to actually deal with the fact that we have no contact shadows on the wall, and that's going to be a color correction work done on our plate shot. So here is my offshoot that's coming from my original footage here. And I'm going to just add another shuffle node. Throw that over here. And this shuffle node, I'm going to shuffle the wall shadow. And if you take a look at the wall shadow, there is no data in the red, green, and blue channel, just the alpha. If I take a look at it and put my viewer to it, you can see there's nothing in RGB. But if I hit the letter A, you can see that we have an alpha channel of shadow. So I'm going to shuffle the alpha into RGB and A just for the last confusion. And then, of course, want to label this and call this the shadow shuffle. All right. So let's add a grade node here, and we'll shove it over here onto our plate shot. And then again, probably good to label this ground shadow, or just wall shadow, I should say. And again, I like labeling it at the node because I want to know what this is, and then I could say what is it doing while it's grading, what's it grading, the wall. So anyway, put that in there. And you have this little output for mask. I'll plug that in. By default, the mask input, if I click on the grade node, is plugged into the RGBA alpha, but I could choose red, green, or blue in this case because they're all basically the same thing coming in from the mask input. So at this point, let's put our viewer all the way down the pipe here, or at least let's put our viewer just to this grade node right here real quick. So let's do some color correction. I could take the gain and start to bring it down, and you can start to see the shadow show up here. Just kind of move this down here and hit the letter H. So you can see that we're getting a nice shadow, but the shadow doesn't match the color of the shadow coming in. This was a bright blue sky day, so the blue sky being a big green screen, but it's a big blue screen, the light's going to come down, bounce off the concrete floor, and fill in the shadows. So as because there's more bounce happening over here, the shadows, which are deep black, are being filled in with the photons that are basically inheriting the color blue, or in this case, because of the weird color correction of the camera, magenta. They're coming in here and bouncing and creating this sort of hue here. Now you can see that the shadow here is very, very dark, and this here is basically, it's getting no fill-in of that blue bounce, but in this case we do have some blue bounce coming in here. So the gain is a great tool to kind of adjust the kind of like the increasing of the shadows. You do have the gamma here, which is another, kind of works the midtones. The offset is where you add a tint. So again, I'm going to hold down control on the color wheel here, pop up my color wheel option here, and you want to make sure this is set to temperature magenta, hue saturation value, red, green, blue. So this allows you to do some color correction. So you can see what I can do is start to add a little bit of purple in here, if you wish. So I could add some blue in here. So you can see it start to giving it a little bit blue, starting to towards that. If I feel like I need some green, I can bring some green in. And then, of course, if you want to add magenta, you can just pull this to magenta here. Now, a really cool tool that I like to use is, again, what my friend Brad taught me, which is adding a saturation node at the end here and putting this to a value of maybe 8 and looking at it through the finale here. And here you can see the contrast in the color a little bit better than your visible eye. So you can see if I just come back to my grade node, you see I have more magenta than I do have this sort of like teal color. So just by taking my offset and doing subtle number values that are very low here, you can see the values are at like 0.004 here. I could start increasing them, or I could just, again, go back to here, hold down control, pop up the little square here. You want to make this bar as large as possible. If you do have that dumb little color wheel in here, make sure you have it off so that you have the longest bar possible to have subtle adjustments as you kind of go through here. So here in this case, keep an eye on this area and this area. I'm kind of comparing the two. Also keep an eye on this area as well. So I'm just going to take my magenta and start to dial that back. That's going to move me towards green. Everything's moving you towards a different hue here, so I might add some blue. You see how these are starting to match up a little bit more, as you can see. So it's again, I'm trying to match that hue as best as I possibly can here. So introduce some green here. That's probably close enough. So now if I come back past that grade node, I'll just go back to this merge node here. You know, you barely see in the color information, it almost looks like desaturation, but there is a match here. And now I can come back to my grade node and actually take the gain and start dialing that down. And again, as you do this, you might find that you have to change up the color correction. We are trying to get a balance here between this shadow and this shadow and this shadow. So as you can see, at least as of right now, the shadows here match, but the shadows over here don't. So again, you have the you have the choice to kind of play with this a little bit and see if you want to make adjustments to it. And again, the darker you make this, the darker, you can have a very heavy blue in here, and you might have to go back in here and take out this blue intensity. You can see that the highest amount we have is blue, right? It's got a 0.007. So I'm going to try to go in between both worlds, this shadow and this shadow. And at that point, I'm going to lasso grab this 7 and start to dial that down a little bit to maybe 0.05. Maybe 0.02. I'll bring my gain back up a little bit. And again, it still feels like this is not matching yet. It still feels like this is still sticking on the wall. And that's because we don't have occlusion-based shadowing just yet. You can see it's still it was way too bright here, and it just doesn't feel like it's attaching. But this is a good start for us. Now, if you want to adjust the solidity of the actual mask itself, you see we have a gradient here. One of the things you can do is to come in here and you can also soften this up, by the way. So if you take a soften and soften that up, you can see the granularity of that shadow is softened up a little bit. And you can also put in a grade node here. So if I take this, I'll just take this, hold down G, I'll move it down the path here, and I'm going to make sure RGBA is set to this because I want to color correct the alpha channel, which is being plugged into my mask. So I will call this the masking grade node, whatever. And I can come in here and this will solidify or harden up the edges. So if I put my viewer to the mask node and make sure I'm looking at my alpha channel, A for alpha, it doesn't matter RGB or A, they're all being color corrected. If I come over here, you can see, you can take the gamma, and the gamma is either going to crush back your whites so you get a hard edge there, or it's going to expand out your whites but give you a crushed edge on the exterior here. So again, if you guys are not familiar with levels and so forth, this is a great example. So if you want to harden that edge, you want to expand it, you can do that. And again, same thing, you can play with the crush blacks point here, or crush the white point here, expand out the shadow. There's a lot of stuff you can play with, and again, it's best to look at this and the final result here. And you can see if I take this gamma and bring it back, I can expand this out. So if you feel like whatever you want to do, go ahead and do it. All right, cool. So all things in fairness, we need to add motion blur to this shadow. We probably could use all of these, and throw them on at the end because it would make sense logistically. But because shadowing is so soft and there's not a very heavy depth of field, I'm not going to do any cloning of Z defocus, of soften, or any of this. I'm just going to take the motion blur node, right click it, edit, and do a clone. And if you're not familiar with a clone, you get this little orange line here, and if you hit the letter Alt E, you can actually hide these lines if you wish. And what this is, it's a clone. It's like a hive, or just like a bunch of a swarm, I should say, of bees. So it doesn't matter which bee is actually selected, it'll change. So for instance, if I put the sample for this motion blur down to 2, this actually will propagate the data over here. If I put this one and put the 3 back again, it propagates here. So why are clones used? Well, because you might want to make an adjustment to the motion blur and you want it to propagate to the other passes. And motion blur needs to apply to anything in the scene, including shadows. So I'm going to drag that all the way up here and plug that in at the last minute here with the motion blur. Now the thing with anything that is, if I come over here and take this entire blur node by grabbing the backdrop, I can hit the letter D to disable it. You'll notice that it also disables all clones that are attached. And this is good because blurs are very expensive nodes, and you want to make sure that those are turned off when you're doing all your color correction work. And then when you're ready to judge color, blurs and so forth, you want to turn it back on. So I'm going to hit the letter D to disable these, just because I just don't want them to be slowing down the system as we start to build the comp. So let's go ahead and label this direct shadow. So I will just grab this area right here and make a backdrop. And I will usually give this a desaturated color. And I'll just label it direct shadows. So you can see I include the grade node in there and just keeping things really nice and tidy from left to right, top to bottom movement here, so that future compositors are not confused and they hate your guts. Now we could add the occlusion shadow next, but I actually want to put in the TV screens in. So this little offshoot here I'm going to pull out, and then I'm going to add another dot node by hitting period and just dragging that down here. And we're going to add a shuffle. We're going to shuffle out that UV pass within our stuff. So let's go over here, make a shuffle node, and drag that right there. And that shuffle node, we're going to pull out the UV pass. As you can see, it just kind of throws through. Let's take a look at it. This information is based on a gradient of green. So if I hit the letter R, as you can see, the red gradient is basically a linear gradient from black to white across. And if I hit the letter G for green, it's a linear gradient from top to bottom for green, top to bottom. So this basically maps out the basic UV space of a typical 0 to 1 UV space, if you guys have done any texturing work. And the colors actually signify importance. Now, what you got to be careful when you're using this pass, because it's being sampled with anti-aliasing, these values here along the edge can give you some trouble because the values are not different. You really do want absolute values when it comes to UVs, which I didn't do in this case. So you can see we have like a grading here. So you're going to get some weird data down here when we start to label this out. So I'm going to obviously label this shuffle UV. And with that stuff, this uses a ST map node. ST maps are great for lens distortion, redistort, undistort. So I'll just make a ST map node, throw that in. It's going to ask for an ST map. So we're going to plug that in right here. And the ST map is asking for UV channels. I'm going to say choose the RGBA, which is really only going to read the red and green channel. And then the source footage is what we're actually going to warp. So the source footage is, okay, what are we going to put on these TV screens? And using masking and a series of key mixes, you can actually have different things displaying on these screens. In this case, we're not going to do that. We're just going to have the same footage as if we're looking at security monitors, we're basically feeding our plate shot into this actual channel here. So let's plug in this source footage with the original here. So I'm going to add I have this dot node that I've already created earlier, probably wondering what was that all about. I'm going to extend that down. That's just the original footage itself. And we will plug that into the source input. And I'll add control and pull that in. This is crossing the streams. We're breaking our rule. We're moving from right to left. This is the exception. And that basically gives us the ST map read. So if I put my viewer now to here, you can see that blue is now in here. Now again, here's where we get these weird artifacts in our layout, and that's because we need absolute red-green values for 0 to 1 gradients. And we're not getting that on the edges because you can see even his shirt is repeating here because this is a darker value. And it's basically reading per pixel for every one of these. Now there's a couple things you can do here. You can actually add a grade node here, and you can call this grade UV if you want. And I'll just take this, and there's a couple things that might help with that. If you take the grade node, you can play with the black point, and as you do this, you can start to see what it's doing. It's repeating the last pixel, and you could take the white point, and it'll shrink down the other way. It's just basic linear math here, and you can just play around with different ones here. You can see what the gamma does. It gives you some really cool effects, like a warped image, and so forth. And then you have offset, which gives you something you probably don't want either. So I'm going to talk about how we can fix this eventually here. So the first thing we need to do before we start affecting this and fixing this edge is getting this thing cut out with an alpha. If I put my viewer to the ST map and hit the A for alpha, you can see we have no alpha channel in here for this. We need to cut this out. We could just crush the blacks here and then actually screen this over, but I actually want to physically cut this out. So the way you do that is from this shuffle node, we're going to add a grade node and make our own makeshift alpha or alpha transparency. So I'm going to be color grading the channels here. And what you want to do here is you want to take your white point and bring it back. And you can see it does harden up the edges as we kind of go through here, so you might want to put this to a value like 0.06 or something. But if you hit the letters R and G, you can see the channel is relatively, it's basically white. If I kind of scan here, you can see the value is a white for alpha. So we just made our basic makeshift alpha. You really can't go the opposite direction. So if I come over here and go this direction, you can see it's not working. So again, we just got to like solidify this and do like a 0.02 or something. And then we will use either the red or green channel. In this case, you can hit R or G, and you can see whatever one looks better for you. I think the red channel looks cleaner. And we'll make that and plug that in with a copy node to redefine the alpha. So I'm going to take the copy node, A for the incoming new alpha, B for the background. And now if we hit the, look through this and hit the A for alpha button, nothing is working yet. And that's because we need to come to the copy node and say, instead of using the alpha channel to redefine the alpha, we want to use either the red or green channel. In this case, we chose the red channel. So now if we take a look, we have a nice alpha cutout here, which is really good. So let's take care of this nasty edge here, and the way you're going to do this, you're going to hit tab and type ERO for erode, and instead of erode fast, you want to do erode filter, and we'll plug that in and put our viewer to it, and it's only affecting the alpha, so I'm going to hit the A for alphas to see the alpha, and I can actually dilate by putting a positive number, erode by putting a positive number, and then dilate the matte. So I'm changing the actual matte edge, and we're going to cut into those nasty edges that had that weird result using this. As you can see, it's currently set to a box filter, so what happens with a box filter is it uses like a matrix, sort of like a nine celled matrix, and you can see it just expands out. It starts to lose its silhouette as you dilate back. So again, dilation is just like how your eyes dilate, is in a negative number, and then erosion is in a positive number here in this case. So you get this cool effect. Now there are other types of filtering. There's triangular filtering, which doesn't give you a really great result in regards to what you're trying. There's quadratic filtering, which gives you this nasty gradient. And then there's Gaussian, again, gives you this nasty gradient. But most of the time you want to use box. So you can see it expands relatively from the normal's edge here. So we can take this at the, it's a value of 0 here. We can kind of shrink it in a little bit. And now we can go ahead and pre-mult the RGBA to the actual, because we haven't done it yet, the alpha. So take the pre-mult node, plug that in, and hit A, and now you can see we have an edge, but if I come to my filter erode, it's going to chomp into that edge there. We are going to get a harder edge result in this, so to kind of balance that out, we'll do an edge blur and throw that on. And that will kind of work it out. Now, we're getting a weird result with the edge blur. I'll talk about that in a minute, so let me delete that really quick. And let's go ahead and merge this on. Now, we have to merge this further down the pipe. So let's move all these goodies down here. And this has to be merged past this blur node. So I will put this saturation node way down here, like that. And let's hit the M for merge, and I will plug that in next. So it has to be after the CG that's added. Put my viewer to it, and voila. So we have, I hit D to disable here, you can see we have blue officially in every one of the television sets. He's not convincing yet, but again, we'll kind of play with this in a minute. So again, I can come back to my filter erode and kind of decide how much I want to kind of chew into this. If I hit an edge blur, which kind of will soften up that edge a little bit, I'll just stick it on right here. And if I increase this, I'll kind of play with this, you'll see we're getting some weird artifact here. Like, what's that all about? Whenever you start to see stuff like this, if I put my viewer to it and hit the A button, you'll see you get some strange weirdness going on here. If you go back to your filter erode button, I'll click there, and if you actually sample these numbers, you can see they're extraneous numbers in the alpha that are like 66, they're going into like weird numbers here. So you want to definitely add a clamp value, which will clamp your everything to a normalized range here. So now after the clamp value, you can see that our values are from 0 to 1 in the alpha channel. So that will resolve the issue in regards to getting edge blur to work correctly. So now if we go back here and just play with this edge blur, we can kind of soften up that edge a little bit. So you can see it's It's got a relatively hard, it's got a very heavy stair-stepped edge, like I said. So it is what it is. And again, you can come back to the grade here that you did on your initial alpha here and maybe soften that up a little bit. Put it to a value like 0.05 or something. And then you can come back to this edge blur and not have to have such a heavy edge blur. So you can see I'm just kind of just giving a little bit of a softness there. You got to watch out for that because you might sit there and go like, oh my gosh, it's a little bit too soft. You can come in here and maybe add a sharpen if you wish, to this. Just add some sharpen to this, and I guess we can just adjust the alpha here, and you can see sharpening up the alpha a little bit. There's a lot of things you can do to kind of mess with this, try to balance all that out. I'm just going to leave that off for now. So we got him in every single scene. You can see we got a nice setup here. Again, this is just makeshift like compositing in here. And again, it doesn't look totally realistic. It's important to realize that sometimes televisions are either overexposed or underexposed, or their color temperature is off compared to the original plate. It's never this clear. They also flicker too, so keep that in mind. So let's add a little bit of color correction work here. Again, I'm trying to maintain that top to bottom, left to right workflow. And I will just add a grade node to color correct the original footage here. I'll also add a saturation node because I might want to desaturate the intensity of this color information. So again, a grade node, if you feel like you need to brighten things up, you could take the multiplier, bring up the exposure, saturation. If you want to bring the saturation down a little bit, you can. We can also add a glow after the edge blur here, so I'll just add a glow. So let's just add a glow in here and throw that on, and now we get this intense glow. Obviously, the tolerance you can kind of pulled up. He still has a halo like he's an angel. So again, I'll bring the brightness down just to get it ever so subtle, like I talked about before, so that you should feel it, not necessarily see it. So I can go ahead and put this up like this a little bit. And, whatever floats your boat. You can see it's really starting to make a difference. And as we scrub through the shot, you can see that the image is updating each one of these windows. Don't forget that, as we come near the end of this whole thing, we need to add motion blur. So again, we have motion blur node here. I'm sorry, not motion blur. Motion blur. And I'll just edit, clone it, and drag that over here to the last sort of step here. We have not added grain yet to any of this stuff, so keep that in mind. We have to actually kind of match the grain. So I'm going to disable and re-enable. It's going to enable all motion blurs. And you can see if I turn it off and on, there's just this ever so subtle motion blur going on. But it's affecting both the actual television screen image and the actual CG. So don't forget grain, okay? It's sort of like that orphan child you have to remember. So I'm going to come back in here again, take this and disable the motion blur, which will disable all the motion blurs. Got to keep those off as we keep building our comp. So I'm going to make an offshoot of this by adding a blur. So take that right there, and if I take the CG, you can see I'm just going to blur this up pretty heavily. And I'm going to do another merge right here, but I'm going to set this one to screen. So I'm going to set this operation to screen. And again, I'll put my viewer down the pipe here. And that kind of allows for, if you take a look, it kind of expands out the glow a little bit. We're going to actually be doing some 3D lighting with the relight tool and the normal map pass and the position pass to kind of get this light to actually show up in this area here, because this is metal and we should see the reflection of this show up in here and be bouncing around and so forth. So we're going to be doing some post lighting inside of Nuke's 3D tool sets here. So you can see this is maybe a little bit too intense for what it is. But what I like to do is I'll blur it up pretty heavily like that, and then I'll take the screen node and just take the opacity down just so I can get a subtle reality. I'm also going to take this merge here, the original merge, and bring it down so I can see a little bit of the dented up screen itself that's been eroded. So this allows me to see Like when we come to this screen here, you can see we're getting a little bit of the illusion of the reflection of the glass element on these old cathode ray tube type televisions that are circa 1982 Blade Runner. At this point, we want to jump to the World Wide Web here and look up keyword search in Google Nuke Flicker Node, and you will find this Snippler link with some actual scripting. You want to get rid of these stupid little numbers along the side here, so you're going to actually click on plain text, and you'll get the basic plain text that you can copy and paste into Nuke. So I'll hit Control-C for copy, and come in here and click nothing and hit paste. So you can see we have a flicker node now. And what this is just a randomized frequency, frequency-based fluctuation of a multiplication intensity value. So for instance, if I come over here and make a constant, and make the constant a color of absolute white, and I will actually, I'll take it as white. Actually, let's put it at 0.5, just for this example, which is 50% gray. And I plug in this multiply node here, and just hit play, you'll see that it's fluctuating minimum value 0.4, maximum value 1. So what this does is it minuses a value of 0.5 in this case. Maximum value is 1. So you'll see if I kind of scrub through here, our values are now at 0.2. So it's actually taken the multiplication down, actually subtracted the lighting information. But if I want the value to go from anywhere from a value of 1 to 1.5, which is really bright, you can see it's going to always stay at the minimum of, in this case, a value of 0.5. It's never going to go lower than 0.5 or the initial color. So again, you can make it go darker or brighter, and then the frequency, if you put this something up to something nuts like 20, you're going to get like disco effect. It's going to like every frame is going to be dramatically different. Whereas a frequency of 1, you're going to get, let's see if it's kind of scrub it. Yeah, it's like a frequency of 1 here. It's still kind of jumpy. Let's see here. If I put this to 0.02 or something, you can see it's rarely, in this case, you should see like hardly any flickering. It's sort of like just like a fade in and fade out. So a frequency of 1 is even pretty dramatic, as you can see here. So what do I usually put this to a value of like 0.7 and then 1.3. And I'll leave the frequency at 1, and we can actually use this as a flickering. So let me just go ahead and make some room here, and I'm being very careful to keep this 90-degree angles up and kind of through the process here. I want to just give myself some room here, and at this point I can take this multiplication and drag it here, and at the same time I could right click it and clone it and plug it right there. You could, of course, copy, paste, and have a different fluctuation of frequency between these two here if you wish, but that's totally up to you. So now, if we go ahead and take a look, and just scrub, we'll have a nice flickering. In fact, I'm going to hit the letter I and the letter O just to get a little bit of a little area here that we can loop, and we should start to see that nice fluctuation of the video screen. Again, you can change up the frequency and the intensity of the multiplier. It's just basically like a multiply node, moving up and down randomly. So you're getting a little bit of a flicker there. And again, you can dial that intensity down here. So if you feel that value is like, I'll put this to 1 and maybe 1.2, you're going to get a heavy frequency, but the contrast of multiplication won't be, it'll be very subtle. So you can see it's a subtle little flickering effect that would happen on these old cathode ray tubes, which is good. So I'm going to put my viewer back to here and here. So that's a nice little addition. So we might as well keep things labeled here. So I'm going to grab all this here, make a backdrop, and we will call this the screens. I'll give it a nice blue color to give me a significant understanding of what it is. And we'll call this the CRT monitor, so forth, and just kind of put that in there. And now we're going to shuffle out the actual occlusion node. So I'm going to actually do a shuffle. This is sort of like nooks and crannies shadows. So I'll throw that in there, drag that down here, and bring my saturation node down a little bit here. And let's go ahead and label this. So occlusion is going to be the overall occlusion. So we shuffle here, and we're going to choose the occlusion pass, overall occlusion. And what I want to do is I want to have the RGB in all channels. So in this case, I'll just choose the red channel. So if I put my viewer to the shuffle node now, you can see that if it R, G, and B, and A, they're all basically the same thing. And we do the same thing again. We add a grade node here, and we'll just go ahead and call this grade occlusion, right? And we have the mask, which we'll pull out here and plug it in, like so. And considering that this is the area that we want to color correct should be the black areas, we're going to invert this. So I'm going to do an inversion and throw that in here so you can see it inverts the information. And the white areas are what we're going to use for the masking here. So I'm doing invert all. And now I could come in here, and if you take a look at the setup here, just the same way that we color corrected before, we can take the gain down, and now we're getting these occlusion shadows. And again, we got to go into the offset and start to shift this towards blue a little bit. We haven't done anything with the blacks yet in the shadows. And the other thing we can do is we can actually come in here to the shuffle node, and we can do a grade node. So we can do a grade and obviously label it grade occlusion, occlusion mask. There we go. And with this setup, again, I could do grade RGBA information. And we're going to take the gamma information and play with it. So if I put my viewer to it, you can see that I can increase by shifting the gamma in a negative value, you could see, or a minus value, you can see that I start to darken up those little shadows there. You can also crush in the matte a little bit by crushing the white, so you can pull that back, but you start to get a hard edge, obviously. And then, of course, the blacks as well, you can kind of like play with that, crush that back, you'll get even harsher shadow. So you can play with these to kind of get the corner a little bit darker. And then coming back here, looking through the viewer, and then just taking your grade node here, you can start to play with this a little bit. So again, if I take the gamma, you can see I'm getting a darker, getting expansion of the shadow itself. And that should be, again, I'm not going to tweak this stuff just yet. I'm going to leave this be, as you can see here. And yeah, that should be good. So I'm going to go ahead and make a dot node here. And there we go, make a nice 90-degree angle. And with that said, I think I can expand this guy out, like right there. And let's take this guy, make a backdrop, and I'll give it a color that is basically no saturation, a high value, but a low saturation, so it looks like a white. That way I recognize it as the occlusion pass. So let's type in occlusion overall. So we've added two different shadows here. The colors aren't yet correct. This still feels like it's sticking out like a postage stamp, but we will eventually take care of that. So with all this set up, again, it's very rough. I'm going to build out my output node. Always have an output node. So I'm going to take the saturation, make a backdrop, and I usually color correct the output node to be this emergency red color. So heavy saturation all the way to red, blue and green brought down. Hold down Control, pull it out. And what I will do is make a right node with an offshoot like this. And plug that right there. Right node is, in this case, we look at things in MOV. And I'll make this animation. And of course, it's rendering via sRGB workflow. Usually in production, you'll have an output node that will have a couple of right nodes on it. One will be like an EXR sequence or a DPX export sequence set to a specific color space for the colorist as he sort of incorporates your final shots. And then you have, for your viewing and critiquing pleasure with your art director, a right node that renders out sRGB QuickTime for them to critique. So whenever we did the Sam Jackson commercials, our incredibly awesome artist, art director, Rob actually was, he would actually at the end of the night do a critique at home. He'd go home and do the critique, and we'd have all the critiques in the morning. But we would drop into a Dropbox our actual QuickTime files, and Rob would do incredible art critiques. The guy's artistry was just, to this day, blows my mind. He's now head of Carbon VFX in Chicago, which again is a great, great VFX place. All the artists there, high respects for all those guys. They're unbelievable. So we'll go ahead and call this the output node. I will never stop praising this production company. It was once called Filmworkers. Now it is Carbon VFX. From the producers to the artists, I've never worked with a crew. I've worked in production in studios before, game studios, and I've never worked with a production crew that I was just so blown away by. And I thank them because it's them being nice enough to give me a job and learn the ropes, as opposed to some other post houses that have yet to give me a call back. You know who you are. It's just that I'm here to help the community. So if you are a post house out there and you're in the Chicagoland area, please give me a ring. Even if I may not be as great as all of your Leonardo da Vinci's that are there, or Picasso's, I can learn and at least teach. My skill set is teaching. So I want to be that mechanic that shows other people how to make great work. But they're going to be the ones that make the great work. I'm going to be the one that kind of sits on the sidelines and watches them create the great pieces of work. So again, I'm going to come over here and set this to leave the default color space. Sometimes when you deal with QuickTime, you might want to put this to 1.8 because it can kind of over gamma the image. So in this case, I will probably drop. Let me see if I can steal an extension up here. I'll just grab. Yeah, here we go. So I'll just steal this extension, keeping it that wonderful root system that I showed you. And I will call this, just call it root folder render test.mov. There we go. So that will allow me to both double check for saturation colors. You can see, we can just see the matching of color information here. And then another thing I like to do, which a lot of people might think is a little overboard, is add a couple more sort of testing tools in here. So I'll do a grade node here that I'll put like right here, from which I'll take a saturation node. Oops. And I'll put the saturation node down to 0. I'll put my viewer in here, and I'll take the gamma and just adjust. This is sort of like adjusting your viewer gamma. This allows me just a very quick example to look at my whites and black values. So I'll just copy and paste this in, and just connect this like here, and put this here, right here, and this time I'll shift the gamma to a negative number. So these are just like sort of quality checks. I can check my different gamma settings here, one slightly down, one slightly up with saturation, and I could just check my color. So you're seeing a contrast in chrominance, you're seeing a contrast in dynamic range, and you can make adjustments for it. So it's a nice little tool set. Last thing I want to do before we end this very long lesson is actually come in here and do some grain work. So what needs grain? Not necessarily the color correction nodes. They are color correcting the granularity of the original plate. They are not. They don't really need to have grain added to them. But anything that is CG, such as specifically, most likely this first screen here that we have, that probably needs granularity or grain. Our CG that we rendered right here needs grain. So the roll call. Most CG is rendered without grain, depending on your samples, or you can degrain your CG if you wish. If you're gonna, I'm not going to use grain. Let's go ahead and use, let's see here, our Furnace Core plugin. So let's do our Furnace Core regrain. We'll plug that in right there. And of course, we need to sample the original footage. We just need to find a sample. Here we're going to cross the streams again, read the grain coming in from the original plate shot, put my viewer to it, and actually I put my viewer to this input node. And the roll call here. I'm going to come over here and just sample an area that's gray. And now we just take a look at our CG. This is going to be computationally expensive, so we'll probably have to disable this as we're working. You can see it's just taking forever. And as you recall, we need to add an unpremult to this, so I'm going to go ahead and just disable. And you got to ask yourself, is that the original CG? So again, I'm going to come over here and make an unpremult and make a premult. So that way we don't get, so we kind of come through here, we don't get any grain over here on the outside here, we just get it here. So if I hit my arrow keys, you can see the grain, and now I can put my viewer to the merge node and compare this to the original grain. You can see it is a little bit too intense. So I'm going to take the grain amount and bring that down. Use my arrow keys, go back and forth. Obviously try to find an area that's dark, and it's still a little too much. Grain size seems a little bit too big too, but there is just a general noise pattern in there, as you can see. So at this point, I'm not sure if you can, let's see, I've never cloned this before. Yeah, you can clone this grain node, I guess, and plug that into the CRT information. So pull that in and only into the first CRT. And obviously the grain has to come from this footage here. So I'll just make a dot node there. Now things are getting, we're starting to get craziness here, right? It's like, oh no, you know, try to keep that 90-degree dedication. So even if you get a lot of dot nodes in here, avoid the confusion by just adding some dot nodes like right there. And there we go. So you can see, got this nice granularity working here as well with the same grain options. Let's see how the screen's looking. Put my viewer to that. And don't forget, we actually have to do the unpremult again. So I will just sort of nudge this stuff back a little bit. And just pull that back there. And let's just do I'm going to have to make more space here, but I think I'll be okay. Let's do unpremult. And then premult. And when you get into these tight situations, I just hold down Control, move back my viewer here, pull this information. Don't allow stuff to get really bunched up. As you work, try to keep things separated, a little bit of spacing in between. So now you can see I've made a little bit of breathing room here. Not much, but it's better than nothing. Let's see here. Yeah. There we go. Keep that nice and tidy. And are we getting it? Let's see. It's beginners. There we go. Yeah, so we got the grain. Let's take a look at it, make sure it's on there. You can barely see it, but I'm sure it's there. Yeah, so, and these are all just little subtleties that we can work on here. And again, I'm going to try to keep this 9-degree angle, you know, perfection down a little bit here. You can see I'm just making room, giving myself breathing room. I don't want to bunch anything up. I find my students do that a lot. They go in swirls too. It drives me nuts. All right, there we go. So there it is, and we are good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to enable my motion blur here real quick. Actually, I'll enable all these blurs by grabbing the backdrop and hitting D. And let's just put our output to the right node. At this point, I'm going to hit play, and we'll just take a look at our shot in its rough CG form. Again, we haven't done any color correction or made adjustments or anything, but it's good to just, after you do what's called your slap comp or whatever, just take a look at this and see how everything's kind of coming together. I still got a roto his foreground hat, but I'm going to wait on that. If I can avoid things that are going to be added on the last minute that might be too computationally expensive or slow me down, I'll wait till the last minute to add things, and I'm going to wait to get rid of his hat. It also allows me to judge the shadow areas without his hat in the way over here. So again, I'm not going to put his hat back until the very end. Okay, so we have got some CG in here. Obviously, everything doesn't feel correct. This feels like it's not even attached. This is very magenta versus the wall that's very teal. You can see that the shadows aren't convincing. The blur might be too intense. The specularity is somewhat lost on here. You can see you have an intense highlight from the sun coming down on a very similar metallic material down here. And also, there should be a little bit of tint and specularity towards blue, and that's what we're getting in our shot. And again, two things that affect color is things such as the way that the camera interpreted the footage. Maybe you set your color balance wrong on your camera or something. Also, again, the lighting of the situation on the day. Is it overcast? Is it blue sky day? There's a lot of different variables, but you basically are forced to color correct to your plate shot. And in this case, we have this sort of like bluish tint highlight. There's a lot of color correction, a lot of work we're going to have to do. We also don't have the reflection of the TV here in the screen. But again, it's a good start. You can just take a look and see. And we're going to be doing three-dimensional color correction to kind of bring this all together. It has to be noted before we end this lesson that this CG, if I talk about the CG, how did I create this CG? I just want to kind of let you guys know. I basically went to the output here of this C node and added a right geo node. And if you have the free version of Nuke, you won't be able to do this, but I exported out an FBX into Maya, rendered it, brought it back in, brought this all this CG, and I actually processed all of the actual different passes through the lens redistort. It's already been redistorted for you, the CG, but be aware when you bring back a linear non-barrel lens distorted CG render, you need to add the lens distortion not just on the actual plate shot, but every subsequent pass. And that's why I made this Uber EXR here and did it all for you. So I just wanted to have that as one last sort of note as we kind of go through here. So again, we can see our comp is getting pretty big as we kind of go through here. But we are coming to the end. We do have a little bit of work we're going to do in regards to three-dimensional, tools such as the relight. And we got a lot of color correction work to do, but that's really what this tutorial is about, cleanup and color.